In 1568, the little kingdom of Transylvania lay on the border between the Ottoman Empire and the expanding Christian world. It was really far away from a whole lot of places, including, most importantly, Rome and Rome's Pope and the Pope's Inquisition. It was a borderland. It was sufficiently removed from all the great capitals of empire that the boundaries between people in that place and even the boundaries between practitioners of faiths could be a little bit blurrier than other places. Points of doctrine that led Italians straight to the gallows were shrugged about out there in the hinterlands of empire, nearly beyond the reach of the powers and principalities that in that time and every time fought over every inch of dirt and every single soul who dwelled upon it. And because of this border mentality, because of this safe-ish distance from the powers that be, this little kingdom in Transylvania became something of a safe haven for dissenters and odd ducks of all sorts. Chief among them, the religious separatists and the theological rebels who would become the first generation of the longest-standing Unitarian tradition in the world, way, way older than our earliest beginnings here in the United States. They were a ragtag bunch from all over Europe. Italians, Germans, Hungarians, Greeks, all gathered together, all running away from something, mostly people who wanted to kill them, and they came together in that remote place in the Eastern Highlands, not just to preach their doctrines, but simply to survive. And so this place that we call Transylvania, in the eastern part of Hungary, beyond the Carpathian Mountains, as Bram Stoker made famous, it was a melting pot of identities. It was a gathering place of ideas. So the leaders of the earliest Unitarian communities in that place were as diverse a group of misfits, intellectuals, and holy outcasts as Christendom had ever known, perhaps before or since. Some of them were busy preaching that all the firm doctrinal boundaries of traditional Christianity did nothing but separate people from each other and lead to the very kind of civil wars over religion that most of them had escaped to Transylvania to flee in the first place. Some of them were preaching that the doctrine of the Trinity, this idea that God is three in one at the same time, just basically made no sense. And some of them were preaching that this doctrine made it harder to see the deep commonalities between the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some of them, these proto-Unitarians, this ragtag bunch, were really just outcast intellectuals running for their lives, trying to find a way to have faith in both the workings of the human mind and the expansive love of God's own heart. All of this was swirling around in the radically tinged air of 16th century Transylvania when a young kid with a wonderfully bossy mother came to the throne of that principality. Now, our children here at River Road, I think, actually know the story better than we adults do. So I'll tell it in brief, just because repetition doesn't always hurt. The story of King John Sigismund, this young Hungarian Transylvanian prince who felt that his kingdom was being pulled apart, as if this whole thing was a house of cards, as if it might just crumble because nobody but nobody in the entire kingdom seemed able to agree about anything that mattered. So King John and his mother, Isabella, they knew that this little corner of relative peace that they had ruled over for a short time would not remain peaceful for a whole heck of a lot longer unless they found a way to fight back all the tides of religious violence that were consuming Eastern Europe and most of the world besides. And so they gathered together a kind of conference In the old history talk, it was called a diet. The diet, the gathering in a place called Torda in the heart of their kingdom. They gathered together religious thinkers of all different stripes throughout the kingdom, and they invited those great minds of each religious tradition to think and to speak and to debate and to make each other mad and to forgive each other over and over again until toleration won the day. And the gathered religious authorities declared that each and every tradition would be safe there to practice and to preach as they pleased. And this Sunday, in fact, right now, as we speak, our friends half a world away are gathered to honor the 450th anniversary of that declaration of toleration, and with it 450 years of Transylvanian Unitarianism. This marked the time when the dissenters could come out of the shadows. This marked the time when the Unitarians could build churches instead of gather in hidden corners. Nobody had to listen to any preaching they didn't like, the Edict of Toleration declared, and nobody gets to kill anybody or put anybody in prison for preaching things they do not personally believe. In the actual words of the Edict of Torda, issued 450 years ago and celebrated today, I love this. In every place the preacher shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. Yes, they were all dudes. We'll leave that for a moment. In every place the preacher shall preach according to his understanding of the truth, and if the congregation like it, well. If not, no one shall compel them to remain. Therefore, none of the superintendents or others shall abuse the preachers, and no one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone according to previous statutes, and it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment or by removal from his post for his teaching of the gospel. And so claiming that power for themselves, claiming that no preacher shall be abused and no congregation shall remain in their seats for preaching they did not like. The dissenting believers in the small towns and the villagers, mostly far away from the great city centers, they planted their own churches. And in those churches, the people gathered to speak about toleration and rational thought and the fact that divinity wasn't confined to one corner of the religious spectrum. And one of those little churches is our partner congregation in the rural village of Fiat Falva, where we have learned and served for over 30 years since American Unitarians like us finally got it together and admitted that our own memory and identity leans way further back than when some old smarty pants white guys at Harvard got annoyed at Ralph Waldo Emerson. Memory leans back. It leans further back than we often acknowledge, and the story never starts in the place where we ourselves enter the narrative. It begins across oceans and centuries in a place and a time where nobody had to be compelled by death or threat or loss of freedom to believe anything other than the dictates of their own souls. 450 years ago, way before the Beatles played the sitar or Westerners discovered yoga, our Transylvanian Unitarian ancestors were already teaching that the great religions of the world had so much more to teach each other than to fight over. They were already teaching that education was the key to the future in a time when children entered the labor force of empires around the world. 100 years before the Salem witch trials on our soil, they were teaching toleration and reason and reverence. And so when we say that memory reaches back, today we reach back to a proud history of those who came before. And not only that founding generation of dissenters, but the generations that followed them, there and across Eastern Europe, when toleration quickly became old news, and eventually that one-time overlooked patch of land we know as Transylvania became another toy batted about by the successive powers that surrounded it. Because we are talking about Eastern Europe at the dawn of the modern age. And because our theological ancestors there are deeply religious and deeply dissenting, they found themselves on the wrong side of nearly every empire and ideology that crossed their path over hundreds of years. Turks, Calvinists, Catholics, Habsburgs, Nazis, Stalinists, every single one came in turn to that land, each overlapping each other. Each came to power in that village who traced their history back to a bright and brief moment of toleration. Each of those empires and ideologies visited their own version of repression and control on those dissenting churches. And if the Unitarians in Transylvania had 50 years or so of relative peace, they had something more or less like 400 years of persecution and forcible impoverishment in the long run. Over the generations, the Unitarians of Eastern Europe lost their churches. They lost their lives. They lost their land. And they worked fiercely even when so much else was taken from them to hold on to their schools, because arts and culture and ethics and reason were the tools that empowered them, even while the dominant culture around them just traded one oppression for another. It was in those hard times that the Unitarian Church took up its motto, the quote from Matthew we heard this morning, "Be ye wise as serpents and gentle as doves." Know who you are, that motto seems to declare. And know what you believe in. Don't be dummies in the face of empire, but don't do violence to your own souls either. Know who you are and where your power lies, and survive to live your values another day. Because vision leans forward, and the story isn't over yet. Their crest has a crown at the top, a memory of that one Unitarian king one time in history. But across the bottom is woven that motto that keeps them ever wary of the wolves at the door, always called onward to the next step in a journey that will not end. So today, in Fiat Falva, my friend Reverend József Szymbolt-Falvi is preaching to a totally packed house. Among them, there's Joel and there's Ursula, and there are so many friends who have been connected to that congregation over centuries, over eras. There are people who have made the pilgrimage to be there with them for this occasion. József is standing in his pulpit, charged with celebrating the memory of 450 years, and a whole lot of people are expecting him not to mess it up. The weight of history lies heavy on him, and I've been thinking of him a lot this week. And when József and I have been emailing over the last few weeks, I let him know I wanted to share a message with you today that would align with what he's preaching over there. And he told me that on this most august occasion, when everybody in town is showing up at church to remember their history, he is preaching about the choices and the possibilities that stretch out in front of the Hungarian Unitarian Church today. If the memory of toleration is their story, he asks, what does the vision of toleration call them to right now? If memory leans backward and vision leans forward, how do the two connect in the choices before us? Not back then, not out there, but right now, when the world crowds in and the balcony is full, and a fiercely insistent present calls us to pay attention. Today, over in Fiat Falva, they are preaching on a favorite text from the Book of Kings that asks every prophet, what are you doing here? Not what did you do before, not what are you doing later, but what are you doing here now? Today in Fiat Falva, the insistent present brings with it rich questions and real challenges. As economic opportunities in rural areas dwindle, young people are increasingly decamping to the cities, and a brain drain of crippling scale complicates the vision of the town, the church, and its future. Immigrants and refugees from around the world are arriving even now in Hungarian towns and villages right across the border, bringing with them newer questions of infrastructure, identity, and change, along with the old questions that have always plagued us of ideological warfare and dissent. And even out there in the hinterlands around Fiatfalva, gathered around bread ovens hundreds of years old, together beneath an organ that still plays the standards of 17th century Unitarian hymnody, our partners are asking what it is their vision pulls them forward to, as if to declare that all of our knowledge and our learning, our heritage, our memory, it's just a tool to better prepare us for the present. And maybe our memories are just that. They are objects of reverence and devotion. They ground us in a story that started long before we personally arrived and bless us with the courage of those we have loved and lost. Perhaps our memories prepare the way for a vision of our lives we have not yet fully realized. There was this brilliant 20th century theologian, Alfred North Whitehead, who once said that it is good and proper to revere the past, to uplift the memory of the brave ones who made us who we are, but the foundation of reverence, he says, is the perception that the present holds within it the complete sum of all existence, the whole amplitude of time, all eternity. We honor the memory, and we create the vision by meeting an insistent present. If we grieve all that we have lost as individuals and as communities, that is well and good. But we can also bless what we have lost, bless the ones we have lost, bless the stories that went before by letting their example dig into our souls in the present. This is how we consecrate the past, by being changed, by learning from it, by remembering that it has real implications today. And so this morning, we are gathered across oceans. We are connected by history to consecrate a past full of courage and full of loss. We gather across oceans to lean forward with a vision of the future that demands brave things of us all. We are not pawns in the hands of history, nor are we passive in the face of mighty empires. We are co-creators of the present. Be ye wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Resist the powers and hold tight to your souls. For the fierce urgency of now demands some things of you and of us all. Amen.